This is part 2 of my interview with editor Emma D. Dryden. To learn more about Emma and all the services she has for authors and illustrators, go to her website at drydenbooks.com.
Authors are always wanting to know sort of what the latest trends are as far as topics and formats and that sort of thing. And editors are often at conferences saying, don't worry about the trends. You need to write what you want, what you're passionate about. But trends do exist. And is there anything going on now that authors should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Laura, and I've been on both sides of that conversation where I'll say to authors, don't worry about trends, don't write to trends. By the time you figure out a trend, it'll be over in 6 months and your book won't be out for 2 or 3 years. You know, what's interesting about that kind of conversation is that what we're seeing now is that there are ways to publish much faster than there used to be. So there could be something to writing to a trend. I would say that's something perhaps for self-publishers. They're the most flexible and malleable to kind of suit that. But that being said, as an editor wearing my purely editorial hat, I don't like to encourage authors to write to trends, just because often when we're aware of a trend, the publishers who are publishing to that trend tend to have enough in the pipeline to suit that trend. That being said, there is something that I'm seeing more of that I think the industry wants to see more of, and that's illustrated novels. And that could be a combination of graphic novels, but not even wholly graphic novels. It's sort of kind of thinking about what Brian Selznick did with some of his recent books, Hugo Cabret, you know, just novels, really strong, expansive fiction that's supplemented and augmented by visuals. And I think we have always enjoyed that in middle grade. I think we're going to see more of it in YA. I think the success of a small publishing house like First Second, which certainly is steeped in a tradition of comics and graphic novels, but they're doing some very interesting illustrated fiction. We're seeing more of it. I personally love it. I think, you know, I was reading just yesterday that, and I'm going to look down to quote this here, teens are using video and photos to communicate rather than texting. And what teens have said about this is that it's simpler and they love the power of the picture. So that's interesting to me that that's how teens are thinking about communicating. So I would think there's a natural extension to the thought of this is how teens might enjoy experiencing story. Is through more picture. Not purely picture, but an interesting combination. So now, authors, don't worry. If you're not an illustrator, that's okay. But I think it asks authors to think more visually, which can be very interesting for an author to do. And I've noticed this, too, when we get into talking about apps, where authors have to think more visually if they're going to start thinking about making apps. In other sort of trends, I think this doesn't quite answer what the trends are, but it answers how do we find out about the trends. There are a couple ways to do this, and I encourage authors and illustrators to be on Twitter, if you can bear it, and follow editors, agents, authors, children's media, follow CBI, follow Dryden Books, follow all of us on Twitter, because we are often talking about what we're seeing as trends, or what we're seeing is kind of quieting down in the marketplace, what's speeding up. You know, there's conversation going on Twitter that authors might find valuable to this. And there's one other sort of site that I'd like to encourage, particularly middle grade and YA authors. It's YPulse, YPULSE. They're on Twitter as well, at YPulse. But this is daily news and insights into the millennial generation. This is tweens, teens, and millennials. for media and marketing professionals. And I find it very, very interesting to hear what teens are actually saying. So for teen and middle grade authors, there are resources to kind of keep you in the mix as to what teens are interested in, how they're communicating, how they're experiencing story, how they're being entertained. For picture book authors, I think the trends still tend to be curriculum-based material, or what topics might be perennial, and also character-driven stories. You hear that a lot with picture books. It's still the case, whether you call it a trend, who knows? But I think those are things to think about.
Right. No, I think those are excellent points. And I think now more than ever, it's really essential that authors be able to get into the mindset of their audience, especially those middle grade and teenagers who really are a much more visual generation than we were, because they've grown up with the internet and Facebook and apps, and even the way the commercials I've been noticing are presented to this generation, they're just structured differently than commercials were in the past, because that's the way these kids are used to getting their little sound bites of information. And I think it's a very exciting time, because, like you said, adding visuals to YA novels is a wonderful idea, and I think it should be embraced. Personally, I can see how that would enhance the whole reading experience quite a bit.
Yeah, exactly. And this too, again, for authors who don't fancy themselves illustrators, and I hope they won't start illustrating if they can't illustrate, because we don't need that. But publishers are thinking about this, agents are thinking about this, so authors, you can trust that this will become part of the larger dialogue. We're discussing this at SCPWI. I'm sure you have, information on this through CBI. So this is just part of the larger dialogue about what we're seeing coming down the pike for publishing opportunity.
And it is something, definitely, if you're self-publishing, you need to keep in mind, because you want to be on par with what's being produced by the publishing houses.
Right.